You have a problem. A big, slithering, venomous problem. You're a British official stationed in Delhi in the late 19th century, and the city is crawling with cobras. They're in the markets, the gardens, the alleyways. They are a constant, mortal threat to every man, woman, and child under your jurisdiction. You need a solution, and you, being a product of a vast and powerful empire, believe in elegant, simple, top-down answers. So you devise a plan. A brilliant plan, really. A plan so logical it's practically foolproof. And this single, brilliant idea would unleash a plague of serpents on the city, unlike anything it had ever seen before. Let's be clear, this wasn't some minor inconvenience. This was life in British-ruled Delhi. Imagine stepping out of your home, not worried about traffic, but about whether a hooded serpent is sunning itself on your doorstep. The fear was a constant, low-level hum beneath the noise of the city. A snake in the water jug, a cobra coiled in a shipment of spices, a flash of scales in the dark corner of a room. For the locals, it was a deadly part of existence. For the British colonists, it was an unacceptable chaos that simply would not do. It offended their sense of order. You see, to the colonial mindset, a problem like a native snake infestation wasn't just a danger, it was an insult. It was a symbol of the wild, untamable nature of this land they were trying to control. It needed to be managed, quantified, and eliminated. Every morning you'd hear stories. A child bitten while playing. A merchant losing his life in his own storeroom. It was like living in a city where the landmines were alive and could creep under your door. Something had to be done. The British authorities, with their perfectly pressed uniforms and their unshakable belief in the power of a good system, decided to take a stand. And their solution was pure, simple, economic genius. Or so they thought. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. If you want to get rid of something, just make it profitable to destroy. The government announced a new policy, a bounty for every dead cobra. You bring the government a dead cobra, they give you money. Simple, effective. It was a perfect example of using market forces to achieve a civic goal. What could possibly go wrong? It's a win-win. The government solves its snake problem, and the city's poorest citizens get a new way to earn a little cash. And for a while, it worked like a dream. The program was an instant success. People from all corners of Delhi started hunting cobras with a newfound enthusiasm. The numbers of dead snakes being turned in for cash started to climb. 1 cobra, then 10, then 100. The government offices tasked with paying out the bounties were probably overflowing with the grim evidence of their success. Officials in crisp white suits would look at the mounting piles of dead serpents and pat themselves on the back. They were taming the wilderness, one snake at a time, using the glorious power of capitalism. They had created the perfect incentive structure, but they failed to account for one tiny, predictable variable. People are smart, especially when there's money on the line. After a few months of enthusiastic hunting, a new problem started to emerge. The supply of wild cobras began to, run a little dry. The hunters were a little too good at their jobs, but the demand from the government for dead cobras, that was higher than ever. Now, if you're a local entrepreneur with a family to feed, you don't just give up when your primary resource becomes scarce. You innovate. This is the moment where human ingenuity, that beautiful and terrifying force of nature, entered the equation. People stopped just hunting cobras. They started farming them. It's basic supply and demand. If someone will pay you good money for a dead cobra, and you can't find any, the most logical next step is to make more cobras. All across Delhi, a secret, slithering cottage industry was born. Families who once lived in mortal fear of these snakes were now discreetly breeding them in their backyards, in pots, in hidden enclosures. They would raise the cobras from eggs, care for them, let them grow to a respectable size, and then unalive them and cash them in. Congratulations. The British government was now the single largest customer for a thriving market of purpose-bred snakes. The government was now paying people to solve a problem that those same people were actively and profitably creating. But how long could a secret so big, so scaly, stay under wraps? Eventually, some sharp-eyed administrator, let's call him Nigel, started looking at the numbers. And the numbers just didn't make any sense. The bounty payments weren't decreasing as the snake population was supposedly culled. In fact, they were increasing. Week after week, an impossibly steady stream of dead cobras was arriving at their door. The supply was endless. It defied all ecological logic. There's a moment of dawning horror that must have passed through that government office. A slow, sickening realization. You can just imagine the conversation. A hushed meeting behind closed doors. "Are you telling me," Nigel would say, his teacup rattling in its saucer, "that we are paying these people to breed the very menace we sent them to eradicate?" The sheer absurdity of it is breathtaking. They had set out to eliminate the cobras, but instead, they had accidentally created an entire economy based on their existence. They were trapped. Their elegant solution had become a self-perpetuating machine of failure. They were funding their own crisis. They had to pull the plug, but they were about to learn that shutting down a bad system doesn't always fix the problem. Sometimes it makes things infinitely worse. The order came down from on high. The Cobra bounty program is canceled, effective immediately. No more cash for serpents. From the government's perspective, this was the only logical move. Stop the incentive, and you stop the cobra farming. Problem solved, right? They sent out the announcement, wiped their hands clean, and probably thought that was the end of it. They had once again failed to think one step ahead. Now put yourself in the shoes of a local cobra farmer. For months, you've been running a successful, if slightly unorthodox, business. You've invested time and resources. Your barn, your basement, your backyard is now filled with hundreds of live, venomous snakes. They are your inventory, your stock, and overnight, the government has just made them completely worthless. Not only are they worthless, but they are expensive to feed and incredibly dangerous to keep around. So what do you do with your inventory of now valueless, highly dangerous products? You do the only sensible thing. You open the cages. You open the pots. You let them go. All across Delhi, thousands upon thousands of farmed cobras were released into the streets. The result was a catastrophe. The city wasn't just back to where it started. It was now submerged in a tidal wave of angry, disoriented snakes. The final cobra population was far, far greater than it had ever been before the British had their brilliant idea. This spectacular, world-class failure gave us a name for this exact kind of paradoxical outcome, a term that perfectly describes what happens when a solution backfires with such magnificent irony. This entire fiasco is what we now call the Cobra Effect. It's the official term for a solution that ends up worsening the very problem it was designed to fix. It's a story so perfect, so illustrative of a fundamental flaw in human planning, that its name has become a permanent part of our vocabulary. It happens when we create an incentive to solve a problem without fully understanding how people will actually respond to that incentive. We think we're clever, but we forget that everyone else is clever too. You see it everywhere once you start looking. In the 20th century, a company offered to pay for every rat's tail to clean up a city, so people started cutting the tails off live rats and releasing them to breed more rats. Governments have offered subsidies for businesses to reduce pollution, only to find that some companies increase their initial pollution just so they can get paid more for reducing it. The Cobra Effect is a universal law of unintended consequences. It's a constant reminder that human systems are complex, messy, and beautifully, hilariously prone to breaking in the most unexpected ways. And it reveals a fundamental truth, not just about governments and economies, but about the very way we think we can control the world around us. The story of the Delhi Cobras isn't really about snakes. It's a timeless lesson in humility. It teaches us that good intentions are never enough. It's a stark reminder that people don't respond to what you hope they'll do. They respond to the incentives you put right in front of them. You can't fight human nature with a clever policy. You have to understand it, anticipate it, and respect its power to turn your best-laid plans into an absolute circus. The road to hell might be paved with good intentions, but the road to a city overrun with snakes is paved with a brilliant idea that forgot to account for people. And it's a powerful warning that the most elegant solution, hatched in the most well-meaning of minds, can be brought to its knees by the simple, predictable, and beautifully relentless force of human ingenuity. Imagine you're standing in your bedroom holding a brick. Outside, it's a perfectly nice day, but you're not looking at the sky. You're looking at your window, the one that lets in the morning sun. You take a breath, mix some mortar, and with a grim sense of purpose, you begin to lay bricks, one by one, sealing the daylight out of your own home. You are plunging yourself and your family into permanent, dusty darkness. Why would any sane person do this? You'd do it because the government had started charging you for the crime of owning a window. And to understand this particular brand of institutional madness, we have to go back to a king who was a little short on cash. Let's rewind to 1696. King William III has a problem. Well, he has several problems, and most of them are named France. Wars, as it turns out, are spectacularly expensive, and the royal piggy bank was looking dangerously empty. The government needed to raise money, fast. But how? Their first thought was an income tax, a tax on what people earned. The public's reaction was, to put it mildly, not positive. The idea of a government official snooping through your personal finances was seen as an outrageous invasion of privacy. It was politically toxic. So the powdered wig bureaucrats went back to the drawing board, searching for a tax that was impossible to dodge, but didn't require them to knock on anyone's door. And then one of them had a brainwave. What if they taxed property not on its value, which was hidden inside, but on something everyone could see from the street? Something like windows. It was perfect. A tax assessor could just stroll down the road, count the windows, and slap you with a bill. No snooping required. It was clean, simple, and from the government's perspective, utterly genius. A tax on daylight itself. Congratulations! What could possibly go wrong? But before they could start counting their new tax money, they had to define their terms. And this is where the simple, elegant idea crashes headfirst into the glorious mess of human reality. What, legally speaking, is a window? The initial law in 1696 was a tiered system. If your house had fewer than 10 windows, you paid a flat rate of 2 shillings. If you had between 10 and 20, you paid more. Over 20, you paid even more. It was supposed to be a progressive tax on the rich, who lived in giant houses with dozens of windows. But then the government got greedy. The rates kept changing, the number of free windows kept shrinking, and the definition of a window became a source of endless, comical debate. Was a tiny perforated grate in a pantry a window? What about a small hole you cut so your cat could get in and out? Tax collectors, eager to meet their quotas, would argue that yes, of course it was. People would find themselves charged for small cracks in their walls or cellar grates. This led to a legal arms race. Homeowners would cleverly disguise windows or board them up just before the assessor came by. The government, in turn, passed new rules stating that any window blocked up after the law was passed still counted. It was a slow-motion catastrophe of red tape, a system so convoluted and absurd that its original purpose, to be simple, was completely lost. And the British public, famous for their love of rules and their even greater love of finding ways around them, responded in the only way that made sense. They picked up their bricks. The sound of the 18th century wasn't just horses on cobblestones. It was the dull, scraping sound of a trowel spreading mortar, followed by the soft thud of a brick being laid into a window frame. Across England and Scotland, a strange architectural plague began to spread. Grand townhouses and humble cottages alike began to develop bricked-up squares on their facades, like scars. It became a bizarre form of protest and self-preservation. Can't afford the tax on your 10th window? Brick it up. Don't want to pay the extra fee for the small window in your child's bedroom? Brick it up. Entire streets in cities like London and Edinburgh started to look like they were winking, with half their eyes sealed shut. It created a visible, depressing map of the nation's tax burden. You could tell the wealth of a family just by counting how many functioning windows they could afford to keep. For the rich, it was a status symbol to have a fully glazed house, a glittering statement that they could afford to literally pay for daylight. For the poor and the growing middle class, it was a constant, miserable calculation. Light and air, or food and rent. And as they sealed out the light, they didn't realize they were also sealing something else in. Your home, now sealed off from the outside world, is no longer a sanctuary. It's a box. Without ventilation, the air grows stale and thick. Without sunlight, the walls become permanently damp, inviting mold to creep across the plaster in dark, spidery patterns. Your house has become a perfect, room-temperature petri dish for misery. And not just misery, but disease. This was the dark, unintended consequence of the window tax. In these dark, damp, airless homes, sickness festered. Diseases like typhus, smallpox, and cholera, which thrive in unsanitary and poorly ventilated conditions, didn't just visit these homes. They moved in and signed a long-term lease. Doctors began to notice a terrifying correlation. The neighborhoods with the most bricked-up windows were also the ones with the highest rates of sickness and death. It was a public health crisis created by an accounting shortcut. The very tax that was supposed to strengthen the state by funding its armies was now physically weakening its citizens, making them sick and less productive. It was the ultimate bureaucratic irony. In their quest for an efficient tax, they had accidentally created an incredibly efficient way to spread pestilence. But people don't suffer in darkness and disease forever. Eventually, they start shouting. And the shouting came from some very loud, very influential voices. By the 19th century, a new generation of social reformers, doctors, and writers were looking at the state of their cities and were horrified. They saw the pale, sickly children who had grown up in near total darkness. They saw the rampant disease that swept through the cramped tenements. And they pointed the finger directly at the window tax. They weren't just complaining. They were building a case, armed with statistics and moral outrage. The famous author Charles Dickens, who knew a thing or two about depicting urban suffering, campaigned fiercely against the tax. A new phrase entered the lexicon: daylight robbery. It was a perfect cutting summary of the law. The government was literally robbing people of daylight. Doctors wrote passionate articles explaining the link between a lack of light and air and the scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that was devastating the poor. The argument shifted. This was no longer a debate about economics. It was a battle for public health, a fight between common sense and a 150-year-old spreadsheet. The pressure was building, and in 1851 the government, facing a mountain of evidence and a storm of public anger, finally caved. The window tax was officially gone. After 155 years of darkness, the bricks started coming down. Light and air streamed back into homes that had been sealed for generations. It was a victory for science, for compassion, and for the simple, undeniable fact that humans need sunlight to live. But you can still see the ghosts of this law today. Walk through the old streets of London or Bath or Edinburgh and look up at the Georgian buildings. You'll see them. Bricked up windows, the color and texture of the bricks just slightly different from the rest of the wall. These are not just architectural quirks. They are memorials. They are stone and mortar testaments to a time when a government, in its search for a clever solution, created a century and a half of misery. It's a chilling monument to a simple truth. A law designed for the convenience of the bureaucrat can become a crippling nightmare for the nation. A nightmare written right onto the face of its buildings. Imagine you're sitting on your porch, watching the sky. But it's not blue. It's turning a sickly yellowish brown. A low hum starts on the horizon, growing into a deep, guttural roar. It's not a storm you recognize. It's a wall, a 1,000-foot-high wall of dirt, moving at 60 miles an hour, and it's coming to swallow your farm, your town, and your world whole. This isn't a nightmare. This was reality for millions of Americans. They called it a black blizzard, and it was the terrifying climax of a disaster they had created themselves. To understand how the most fertile land in America was turned into a weapon against its own people, we have to start with the most dangerous promise ever made, the promise of free land. It all began with an idea that sounds like the bedrock of the American dream. In 1862, the U.S. government passed the Homestead Act. The deal was simple and almost too good to be true. They would give you 160 acres of land, absolutely free. All you had to do was move there, build a house, and farm it for 5 years. It was a golden ticket for millions. Immigrants from Europe, struggling families in the East, a chance to own a piece of the world and build a future. They looked at the maps, saw the vast, empty expanse of the Great Plains, Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and saw paradise. They called it the last frontier, a clean slate. There was just one tiny microscopic problem: the people writing the law in Washington, D.C., and the settlers dreaming of their new life had absolutely no idea how this land actually worked. They were about to try and tame a landscape that wasn't meant to be tamed. The Great Plains wasn't a forest you could chop down or a rocky field you could clear. Its secret, its strength, and its very soul was the grass. For thousands of years, a complex ecosystem of native prairie grasses had covered the landscape. This wasn't like the grass in your lawn. These were giants, with root systems that burrowed 10, 15 feet deep into the earth. This dense, tangled web of roots was the only thing holding the topsoil in place. It was nature's rebar, locking the ground together against the region's legendary winds and periodic droughts. But when the settlers arrived, they didn't see a miracle of ecology. They saw a nuisance. They saw an endless sea of grass standing between them and their corn and wheat. So they brought out the one tool they thought would solve all their problems: the steel plow. With a sound like a zipper tearing open the earth, they sliced through the ancient sod, ripping up the root systems that had held the plains together for millennia. And for a while, it worked. The newly turned soil was rich and fertile, and the crops grew tall. But with every furrow they plowed, they were unknowingly dismantling the very system that kept their world from blowing away. They were turning millions of acres of stable earth into a fine, loose powder, just waiting for the right conditions to take flight. And those conditions were coming, pushed along by a global war that turned wheat into gold. When World War I erupted in Europe, the demand for American wheat skyrocketed. Suddenly, the plains weren't just a place to live, they were a gold mine. Patriotic slogans like, "Wheat will win the war," echoed across the country. Prices soared. A farmer could make more money in one good harvest than their parents had made in a decade. A frenzy took hold, a feverish rush they called the Great Plow-Up. People mortgaged their homes to buy more land. They abandoned crop rotation and other safe farming practices. Every spare acre was torn up and planted with wheat. They were treating the land like a factory, not a living thing, pushing it to its absolute limit for short-term profit. They were cashing checks that the land couldn't honor. And just as this frenzy reached its peak, a new invention arrived that allowed them to accelerate their march toward disaster. The gasoline tractor became common on the plains in the 1920s. It was a miracle of modern engineering, and in this specific context, a weapon of mass destruction. Before the tractor, a farmer with a team of horses could plow a few acres a day. It was hard, slow work. With a new iron horse, one man could rip through dozens of acres in the same amount of time, tearing up the last remaining patches of native grass. The scale of the destruction became biblical. Between 1925 and 1930 alone, farmers plowed up over 5 million new acres, an area roughly the size of New Jersey. They had created a 100 million acre carpet of loose, pulverized dirt. They had built the world's largest sandbox, a perfect stage for a catastrophe. All the system needed now was one final push, and it came in the form of a devastating multi-year drought that began in 1930. The rain simply stopped. The crops failed. The soil, baked by the sun and no longer held by roots or moisture, turned to dust. And then the wind came. Not the gentle prairie breeze, but the relentless, howling winds the plains were famous for. It picked up the loose topsoil and created something the world had never seen before. The black blizzards began to roll. These weren't dust storms. They were moving mountains of earth. They blotted out the sun for days at a time, plunging towns into a gritty, suffocating darkness at high noon. The dust was so fine it seeped through every crack, under every door, through every window frame. Housewives would hang wet sheets over windows and doors, a futile attempt to catch the dirt. They would wake up in the morning to find a layer of brown silt covering their children's pillows. It was in their food, their water, their lungs. A new, deadly illness emerged: dust pneumonia. The static electricity from the swirling dust was so strong it could short out car engines and knock a man down if he touched a metal fence. The world had turned inside out. The very soil that was supposed to give them life was now actively trying to bury them. The American dream had curdled into a permanent, waking nightmare. Farms that had been in families for a generation were buried under dunes of dust. Livestock choked to death. Families, their lungs raw and their spirits broken, finally gave up. They had lost everything. They packed what little they owned, a mattress, some pots and pans, their children, onto rusted, overloaded jalopies and fled. They became the Okies, a term used for migrants from Oklahoma, but soon applied to anyone escaping the Dust Bowl. They headed west, chasing a rumor of work in California, following the path laid out in John Steinbeck's great novel, The Grapes of Wrath. But there was no promised land waiting for them. They were met with suspicion and hostility, treated as vagrants. They were the first American climate refugees, forced from their homes by a disaster born from a lethal combination of good intentions, profound ignorance, and unrestrained greed. Eventually, The rains returned, and the government, horrified by the scale of the crisis, began to implement massive soil conservation programs. They planted millions of trees to act as windbreaks and taught farmers new techniques to preserve the soil. Slowly, painstakingly, the land began to heal. But the Dust Bowl was never forgotten. It stands as one of the greatest man-made ecological disasters in history. It's a permanent, terrifying reminder that the Earth is not a resource to be endlessly exploited. It's a complex, delicate system, a system that can be broken. The settlers of the Great Plains were given a garden, and in their rush to make it bloom, they turned it into a desert, proving that the most destructive force on the planet isn't a storm or a drought. It's human ambition without wisdom. Imagine your government declares war on a bird. Not a symbolic war, but a real one. Your job as a citizen is to go outside and make noise. For hours. You and your neighbors, your friends, your children, everyone, banging on pots, pans, drums, anything that clatters. The goal? To create such a relentless, inescapable racket that the sparrows in your city, unable to land and rest, will fly until their tiny hearts give out, and they fall dead from the sky. This wasn't a village festival. This was national policy. An entire nation of 600 million people mobilized to personally exhaust small birds to their demise. To understand how a country arrived at this point of spectacular, organized madness, you have to understand the mind of one man. That man was Mao Zedong, the leader of the People's Republic of China. By 1958, he was impatient. He had a vision for China, a grand utopian dream called the Great Leap Forward. The goal was as simple as it was impossible: to transform China from a rural, agricultural society into a modern, industrial superpower, practically overnight. It was a national project fueled by revolutionary fervor, a kind of collective caffeine high. Mao believed that with enough willpower, the Chinese people could bend reality to their will. And he decided the first step was to clean house. He launched a nationwide campaign to eliminate the four pests, the four creatures he deemed responsible for holding China back. The list included rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. The first three made a certain kind of sense. They spread disease. But sparrows? The official charge was economic sabotage. Sparrows ate grain. According to Mao's scientists, every sparrow consumed 4.5 kilograms of grain per year. By eliminating them, they calculated China would save enough food to feed tens of thousands of people. It was a simple, powerful equation. A war on a bird was a war for prosperity. And when Mao spoke, the nation listened. The only problem was, his equation was missing a few variables. So the war began. In the spring of 1958, China erupted in a symphony of chaos. From the bustling streets of Beijing to the smallest rural villages, the people surged into action. They were given their orders. Make noise. It was a shockingly effective low-tech strategy. By denying the sparrows any place to land, they were essentially turning the sky itself into a weapon. People climbed onto rooftops, banging gongs. Children ran through the fields with slingshots and scarecrows. Factory workers beat on oil drums. The noise was constant, a 24-hour-a-day assault on the senses. Accounts from the time describe people beating pots and pans until their hands were raw. They chased the birds for miles. The sparrows, panicked and confused, would fly and fly until, one by one, they would spasm and drop. They rained down onto the streets, into the fields, onto the rooftops. It was a massacre by exhaustion. The campaign became a source of national pride. Newspapers ran glowing reports, complete with photographs of mountains of dead sparrows. School children were given awards for their kill counts. It was the human will, triumphant over nature. And believe it or not, this utterly insane plan worked. It worked spectacularly well. Within a couple of years, the Eurasian tree sparrow was pushed to the brink of extinction in China. The government declared a resounding victory in the People's War on Sparrows. Congratulations, humanity. You had successfully bullied a 5-inch tall bird into oblivion. Propaganda posters celebrated the achievement. The fields were now safe. The grain was now secure. The nation had followed its leader's command with perfect, terrifying efficiency and had eliminated the enemy. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like Mao's simple equation was correct. They had subtracted the pest and added to the harvest. They had won the battle against the sparrows. They just didn't realize they had declared war on the harvest itself. Nature, it turns out, keeps very detailed accounts. And it doesn't care about your ideology. The Chinese leadership, in their single-minded focus on the grain sparrows ate, had overlooked a crucial part of their diet. Sparrows weren't just eating grain, they were eating insects, lots of insects. Specifically, they were the primary predator of locusts. With the sparrows gone, the locust population, now free from their main enemy, exploded. It was an ecological checkmate. They hadn't just removed a pest from the equation, they had fired the entire pest control department and sent them a thank you note. By 1959, the year after the campaign's peak, the countryside was hit by a new plague. Swarms of locusts, on a scale not seen in generations, descended upon the fields. A living, breathing, chewing plague, they swept through the provinces, devouring everything. The grain that was supposed to be saved by the sparrows' demise was now being annihilated by the bugs the sparrows used to eat. The triumph of the Great Leap Forward was turning into a biological nightmare. And this ecological collapse slammed directly into a much larger, man-made storm. The war on sparrows was just one part of the wider disaster of the Great Leap Forward. The government had forced farmers into giant, inefficient communes. They had ordered them to melt down their farming tools to make useless backyard steel. The entire agricultural system was already broken. The locust plague was simply the final, killing blow. The harvest of 1960 failed catastrophically. The grain stores were empty. The result was the Great Chinese Famine, a demographic catastrophe that led to the passing of tens of millions of people. It was one of the worst famines in all of human history, a period of unimaginable suffering that emptied the countryside. And the irony was stomach-churning. The very campaign launched to save every last grain of rice had directly contributed to the loss of all of it. It was a perfect, horrifying illustration of the law of unintended consequences. Faced with a disaster of their own making, the architects of this war on nature had to make a choice. They could double down on their ideology, or they could face the grim reality. To their credit, they chose reality. In 1960, Mao quietly reversed the policy. The sparrow was officially exonerated. In one of the most absurd bureaucratic pivots in history, the sparrow was removed from the 4 pests list, and its spot was unceremoniously taken by the bedbug. The damage, however, was done. The ecosystem was so broken, so out of balance, that the Chinese government had to resort to the ultimate irony. They began to secretly import sparrows from the Soviet Union, releasing them into the countryside in a desperate attempt to undo the damage. They were forced to import the very enemy they had just spent years and immense national effort to publicly annihilate. It's a brutal lesson, written in the language of famine and loss, that when you declare war on reality, reality always wins. Imagine you're dragging your family pet out into the street. It's a cat, maybe a sleek black one that likes to sleep at the foot of your bed. But today, you're not petting it. You're joining your neighbors in a kind of frantic, grim festival. All around you, people are rounding up the town's cats, not to care for them, but to systematically destroy them. You do this not because you hate the animal, but because you've been told it's a demon, a furry little vessel for the devil himself. You've been told this is God's work, and by doing God's work, you are about to help unleash the single greatest catastrophe in European history. To understand this colossal, fatal error, we have to start with a very angry pope. Let's go back to the year 1233. Pope Gregory IX, a man who didn't do subtle, is having a bad day. He's hearing disturbing reports from Germany about a heretical cult. According to his informants, these heretics were engaging in secret, spooky rituals involving orgies, a mysterious, pale man, and for some reason, the worship of black cats. For Gregory, this was the last straw. He decided to act, and he did so by issuing a papal bull, which is basically the medieval equivalent of a globally distributed all-caps memo from God's CEO. It was called Vox in Rama, and it was a blistering condemnation of this supposed cult. It described their rituals in lurid detail, and most importantly for our story, it officially linked the black cat to demonic forces. It wasn't just a bad omen anymore. It was an enemy combatant in a spiritual war. This papal decree spread like wildfire across Europe, and the result was predictable. If cats are agents of darkness, then being a good Christian means getting rid of them. A continent-wide war on cats began. They were hunted, trapped, and disposed of by the thousands, seen as a physical manifestation of evil. Pious citizens believed they were purifying their communities, making the world safer and holier. They had just officially declared the cat an enemy of God. And in doing so, they had accidentally rolled out the red carpet for a much smaller and far more dangerous enemy. Nature, as you know, hates a vacuum, and the vacuum created by the missing cats was soon filled by rats. The common European cat was the #1 predator of the black rat. It was a simple, brutally effective system of pest control that had worked for centuries. With their main predator suddenly being systematically eliminated by a paranoid human population, the rats basically threw a multi-generational party. Their population exploded. They scurried through the newly purified towns and cities, their numbers swelling unchecked. They were in the granaries, the homes, the marketplaces. It was the world's biggest all-you-can-eat buffet, and business was booming. For the people of the 13th and early 14th centuries, this was a nuisance. More rats meant more spoiled food and a general sense of grime. They had no idea they were living on a powder keg, because the rats weren't the real killers. They were just the getaway car. The real culprit was the passenger they were carrying. That passenger was a bacterium named Yersinia pestis. It lived in the blood of the rats and was transmitted by the fleas that fed on them. As long as this deadly trio, flea, rat, and bacterium, stayed relatively contained, humanity was mostly safe. But in the early 14th century, something changed. A new, hyper-virulent strain of the plague emerged in Asia and began to travel west along the trade routes. In 1347, it reached the shores of Europe. A fleet of Genoese trading ships, returning from the Black Sea, pulled into the harbor at Messina, Sicily. The townspeople who gathered at the docks were met with a horrifying sight. Most of the sailors on board were already gone, and the few who were still alive were delirious with fever, covered in strange black boils. The Sicilian authorities ordered the death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. The rats, carrying their microscopic cargo, had already scurried down the ropes and into the city. The biological bomb had been delivered. The disease that followed was like something out of a horror story. They called it the Black Death. It came in several forms, but the most famous was the bubonic plague, which caused the lymph nodes in the armpits and groin to swell into grotesque, painful lumps called buboes. Fever, chills, and exhaustion would follow, and for most, the end came swiftly. And it wasn't just spreading, it was exploding. And the Europe it landed in was the perfect petri dish for a pandemic. Medieval sanitation was, to put it politely, a theoretical concept. Cities were crowded, filthy, and overflowing with refuse. It was a rat's paradise. And in this paradise, there was no longer a natural check on their population. The continent's antivirus software, the humble house cat, had been uninstalled a century earlier by papal decree. The very institution that was supposed to provide spiritual protection had, through its fear and superstition, stripped away Europe's biological protection. The rats and the fleas they carried swarmed through the cities and towns with virtually nothing to stop them. The people had cleansed their towns of imaginary demons, only to make them defenseless against a real one. The result was the Great Dying. The Black Death swept across Europe with a speed and ferocity that felt apocalyptic. It moved along trade routes from Italy to France to Spain, England, Germany, and Scandinavia. The math is staggering and hard to even imagine. In the space of about 4 years, the plague wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe. Think about that. In some towns, so many people passed away that there was no one left to bury them. Society began to break down. Doctors and priests who tended to the sick were often the first to go. People abandoned their families, their homes, their cities, fleeing in panic, which only helped spread the disease further. It was the world's biggest, most terrifying game of tag, and you couldn't see who was it. They were about to learn a brutal lesson in biology, a lesson taught in the language of empty villages and mass graves. The plague didn't just end lives, it ended an era. The world that emerged from the shadow of the Black Death was fundamentally changed. With so many workers gone, the old feudal system, where peasants were tied to the land, began to crumble. Labor was suddenly valuable, and survivors could demand better wages and more freedom. It shook the foundations of the church, whose prayers and pronouncements had been powerless to stop the dying. It was a brutal, agonizing reset button for European civilization. But for those who survived, the world they woke up to was fundamentally, then recognizably different. And slowly, as the superstition began to fade, a new understanding dawned. The Black Death eventually receded, burning itself out after consuming a horrifying portion of the continent. And in the quiet aftermath, the humble cat, once cast as a demon, slowly regained its place. People, perhaps not even consciously understanding the ecological math, realized that a cat in the barn was better than a dozen rats in the grain. The feline went from being a symbol of heresy to a valued and vital member of the household. The story stands as a chilling testament to the power of superstition. It shows how fear, legitimized by authority, can lead an entire society to wage war on its own protectors, clearing the path for a catastrophe that would dwarf any threat they had imagined. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest danger isn't the evil you imagine, but the good you destroy. Imagine you're standing in a field of sugarcane in Queensland, Australia. It's 1935. You carefully open a small crate, and out hops a hero. It's a toad, a big, bumpy, important-looking toad. You and your fellow farmers release 101 of them into the wild, with the hope and excitement of a general unleashing his elite special forces. You believe this amphibian is the silver bullet that will save your livelihood. You have just proudly detonated a biological bomb that will still be exploding across your continent almost a century later. A problem that only gets bigger, uglier, and more unstoppable with every passing year. To understand how this single, hopeful act became Australia's most infamous and unending ecological nightmare, you have to understand the tiny monster they were trying to fight. The problem, back in the 1930s, was sugar. Australia's sugarcane industry was a powerhouse, but it was under attack. The villains of this story were two species of beetle, the greyback cane beetle and the French's beetle. Their grubs, tiny, white, squirming nightmares, lived underground and chewed through the roots of the sugar cane, destroying entire crops from below. For the farmers, it was a slow-motion disaster. They were losing a fortune. They tried everything: chemicals, manual removal. But nothing worked. They were desperate for a savior. Then they heard a story from halfway across the world, a rumor of a miracle cure used in the sugar plantations of Puerto Rico. The hero of that story? A giant toad from South America, a creature with a legendary appetite. It was the cane toad. On paper, it was the perfect solution, a natural predator to solve a natural problem. The plan was born: import this champion amphibian and let it feast. So, they sent an entomologist to Hawaii, where the toads had also been introduced, to grab a breeding population. He returned with a suitcase carrying 102 toads, the founding fathers and mothers of a new Australian dynasty. They were treated like celebrities. Scientists studied them, marveled at their size and hardy nature. This wasn't just a toad. This was a biological superweapon. It could eat almost anything. It laid tens of thousands of eggs at a time, and it was tough as nails. The plan was simple: breed them up and release them into the cane fields. Let them loose on the grubs. In August 1935, the first waves of their toad army were deployed into the fields of northern Queensland. The farmers held their breath, waiting for the beetles to vanish and their profits to return. And they waited. And they waited. It didn't take long for them to realize they had made a catastrophic and, frankly, kind of stupid miscalculation. The plan failed, spectacularly. It turned out that the cane toad and the cane beetle operate in two completely different worlds. The beetles and their grubs lived either high up on the cane stalks or deep in the soil. The toads, being toads, live on the ground. Their paths never crossed. It was like hiring a shark to catch eagles. They never even met. The toads, having been promised a feast of cane beetles, basically shrugged, looked around, and realized they had just been released into the world's biggest all-you-can-eat buffet. So, they ate everything else. Insects, mice, snakes, lizards, other frogs, your cat's food if you left it on the porch. They weren't picky. They were survivors. Their one job was a total bust. But their failure to solve the beetle problem was nothing compared to the new, far more horrifying problem they were about to create. The real disaster began the first time a native Australian predator decided to try and eat one. See, the cane toad didn't travel alone. It came with a secret weapon, a feature the Australian ecosystem was completely unprepared for. On its shoulders, it has two large glands that ooze a thick, milky white poison called bufotoxin. It's a toxic cocktail designed to cause cardiac arrest in anything that tries to eat it. In its native South America, local predators had co-evolved with the toad for millions of years. They knew to leave it alone. But in Australia, the local wildlife had no idea. A goanna, a quoll, a snake, even a freshwater crocodile would see this fat, slow-moving, juicy-looking meal and think, jackpot. They would bite down, get a mouthful of poison, and that would be it. The result was a mass die-off of Australia's native predators. The very animals that kept the ecosystem in balance were being wiped out by a walking bag of poison that humans had deliberately introduced. The toad had no predators. It had an endless food supply, and it was very, very good at making more toads. This is where the story turns from a failure into a full-blown invasion. From those original 102 toads, the population exploded. The numbers are almost meaningless, they're so large, but current estimates put the cane toad population in Australia at over 2 billion. Yes, billion with a B. They began to spread from those original release sites in Queensland, marching across the continent like a warty, unstoppable army. They move at a terrifying pace, covering up to 60 kilometers in a single year. This isn't just a migration, it's evolution on hyperspeed. Scientists have discovered that the toads at the front line of the invasion are different. They have longer legs, bigger bodies, and move faster and in straighter lines. They have literally evolved into super invaders in just a few dozen generations, purpose-built to conquer the Australian continent. They've crossed deserts and swum rivers, a slow-motion biological tidal wave that Australia has been powerless to stop. And this unfinished nightmare is still unfolding today. For nearly a century, Australia has been at war with the cane toad, and the toads are winning. Humans have tried everything. There are toad-busting community events where people go out at night with buckets and humanely dispose of them. They've built toad-proof fences around precious waterholes. Scientists have tried to develop targeted bioweapons, but the risk of harming native frogs is too high. The tragedy is that there is no silver bullet. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. The toads are now a permanent, poisonous part of the Australian landscape. The best hope lies in adaptation. Some native species are learning. There are crows that have figured out how to flip the toads over and eat their insides, avoiding the poison glands. Scientists are even trying to teach endangered quolls to associate the toads with sickness, so they learn not to eat them. It's a desperate, piecemeal effort to teach a continent how to live with a monster it never asked for. The cane toad is more than just an invasive species. It's a living monument to hubris. It's a lesson written in poison and ecological devastation that when you try to play God with a complex natural system, you don't just risk failure. You risk creating a nightmare that you can never wake up from. Imagine you're a government agent in 1920s America, standing in a dark, damp cellar. You're holding an axe. All around you are barrels of whiskey, beer, and wine. With a sense of righteous purpose, you raise the axe high over your head and bring it crashing down. The wood splinters, and a river of illegal booze gushes across the floor. You feel like a hero, a soldier in a moral crusade to save the nation's soul. You are personally destroying the demon of drink. What you don't realize is that with every swing of that axe, you're not killing a demon. You're feeding one. A much larger, much more violent one that is being born in the shadows, getting rich off your hard work. To understand how America's attempt to sober up accidentally created the most powerful criminal empire in its history, we have to look at the good intentions that paved the road to hell. It all started with a simple, noble idea. For decades, a powerful movement had been growing in America, the temperance movement. Led mostly by religious groups and women's suffrage advocates, they looked at the country's saloons and saw the root of all evil. They saw husbands wasting their paychecks, workers showing up drunk and getting injured, and families falling into poverty. Their diagnosis was simple. Alcohol was a poison on the nation's character, and their solution was even simpler. Get rid of it. Entirely. They launched one of the most effective public relations campaigns in history. They produced posters showing sad children outside saloon doors. They gave passionate speeches. They called it a war for the soul of America. And against all odds, they won. In 1919, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. A year later, the Volstead Act was passed to enforce it. The nation was officially, legally dry. They believed they had saved the country. Congratulations. What could possibly go wrong? The first sign that this noble experiment was going to be a spectacular failure was the law itself. It was a masterpiece of unintentional loopholes. While you couldn't legally sell alcohol, the law didn't actually say you couldn't drink it. So, anyone with a well-stocked wine cellar before the law went into effect was perfectly fine. But the real comedy was in the exceptions. The law allowed for the sale of wine for religious services. Suddenly, applications for clergy members skyrocketed. It also allowed doctors to prescribe medicinal whiskey for a whole list of ailments, from anxiety to cancer. Spoiler, it didn't help. Pharmacies across the country suddenly found themselves doing a booming business in prescriptions that looked a lot like a pint of bourbon. It was a leaky dam from day one. But these little trickles of legal booze couldn't satisfy a nation that, it turned out, was still very, very thirsty. That massive, unquenchable demand created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a new kind of American entrepreneur. They were gangsters. Before Prohibition, organized crime was mostly a local affair, small-time thugs running neighborhood rackets. But the 18th Amendment was the greatest gift they could have ever received. It was like the government had just handed them the exclusive rights to a multi-billion-dollar industry. Overnight, street gangs transformed into sophisticated, vertically integrated corporations. They didn't just sell alcohol. They controlled the entire supply chain. They had the rum runners, who smuggled it in from Canada and the Caribbean in high-speed boats. They had the bootleggers who operated secret distilleries. And they had the speakeasies, the tens of thousands of hidden bars that popped up in basements, back rooms, and apartments across the country. To get in, you just needed a password. And at the top of this pyramid were men like Al Capone in Chicago. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a CEO. He provided a product the public desperately wanted, and he became fabulously wealthy and powerful doing it. But his business model had one very big, very violent expense. That expense was competition. And in the business of illegal booze, you didn't handle corporate takeovers with lawyers. You handled them with Tommy guns. Prohibition turned America's cities into war zones. Rival gangs fought bloody turf wars for control of the lucrative bootlegging territories. The most famous example, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, saw Capone's men, disguised as police officers, execute 7 members of a rival gang in a Chicago garage. It was brutal, public, and shocking. But why weren't the real police stopping them? Because the river of illegal cash was so vast, it didn't just enrich the criminals, it poisoned the entire system. Low-paid police officers, politicians, and judges were faced with a simple choice: uphold a law nobody liked, or take a bribe that was worth more than their yearly salary. The choice, for many, was easy. Entire police departments became subsidiaries of the mob. The very people tasked with enforcing the law were now on the payroll of those breaking it. And while the gangsters were getting rich and the cops were looking the other way, the product they were selling was getting more and more dangerous. The average person drinking in a speakeasy wasn't getting high-quality, aged whiskey. They were drinking whatever the bootleggers could get their hands on, or whatever they could cook up themselves. This stuff was called bathtub gin for a reason. It was often made from industrial alcohol, the kind used for paint thinner or fuel, which was denatured by the government by adding poison to make it undrinkable. The bootleggers would then hire chemists to try and remove the poison. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't. Drinking this concoction was a game of Russian roulette. People were struck blind. They were paralyzed. Thousands were unalived by toxic moonshine. The law that was supposed to protect the public's health was now directly responsible for poisoning them. It had failed to stop drinking, it had created a criminal empire, and now it was turning a nightcap into a potential death sentence. By the early 1930s, it was clear to everyone that the noble experiment was a catastrophic failure. The country wasn't more moral, it was more violent and more corrupt. The Great Depression had also hit, and the government was broke. The idea of all the potential tax revenue from legal alcohol sales started to look very appealing. Public opinion, which had once been so strongly in favor of the ban, had swung dramatically in the other direction. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed, repealing the 18th. Prohibition was over. The nation let out a collective, thirsty cheer. But the end of the law wasn't the end of the problem. The 13 years of chaos had changed America forever. The vast, wealthy, and highly organized criminal syndicates that Prohibition had built didn't just disappear when alcohol became legal, they just diversified. They moved into new rackets, using the money and power they had gained from bootlegging to cement their influence for decades to come. The war on alcohol was over, but the army it created was just getting started.